Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's IG Live. Today, I am very excited to be talking to a longtime MKB member. That's Puneeta Chhitwal-Varma of Maple and Marigold. And Puneeta is an author, educator, speaker, better food advocate, and mom living in Toronto. Hold on. And I see her on here. We'll get her on here in just a minute. We're going to be talking about how to craft a joyful nourishes yourself and the planet. And those are things that sometimes people don't always put together. We think of, sometimes we think of climate conscious food as being boring or a lot of work. And she's here to tell us that that is not the case. Welcome.
Hi, Leanna. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I am really good. I'm so happy to see you. It's almost in real life.
Yes, almost in real, so close. It is so great to talk with you after working with you for so many years. And I'm just happy that we were able to make it work for you to be on here. And why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for those that don't know you and tell us, where did your love for food and cooking come from?
Oh, the introduction is always hard, but hi, I'm Puneeta. Um, I am a newly minted author, and I have a book coming out in, I think, exactly 6 months is what I want to say. Earth Day next year, April 2024, I have a book coming out. But other than the book, I teach people how to make low waste, climate friendly, climate smart choices that are still, affordable, accessible, and that work for our real lives, because it needs to all work for everyday living, right? And so that's my work. You can often find me on various media places, TV, radio in Canada, and I write for a number of other people, and I write for myself. You can find me at Maple and Marigold, because it's Maple where I live now in Canada. I'm Canadian, but my roots are in India, and that's the Marigold. So you'll often find me stepping carefully between the India and the Canada and having a lot of fun with it.
And did you always have a love for food and for cooking, or is that something that came along later?
I I did always have a love for food, not so much for cooking. I think the first meal I cooked was around the age of maybe 22 or 23. I mean, I followed my mom in the kitchen all the time. My dad was in the Indian military. I grew up in India. And so we moved with the army. We moved every 18 months, every 24 months. My brother and I, we got accustomed to relocating, right? New schools, new homes. But I kind of knew, like, my mom was the general in charge. Even though my dad was the general at work, she was the general in charge at home, because I knew if the house was packed and then unpacked, and if the kitchen and the dishes and the spices were unpacked, I knew that we would kind of feel settled in. And even if it was a new city, which often it was, new city, new state, and then later new country, I knew if we'd unpack the kitchen, we'd kind of find a place. And yeah, and that cooking, that first meal at home, because I'm such an advocate for cooking at home if we can make it work. And that first meal at home often means that it will all it will all soothe itself, right, over the next weeks, because moving is hard.
Mhm. Definitely. And I love that idea that cooking, having the kitchen, that kind of somehow kind of makes the home. That really is such a central part of what makes a house feel like a home, is when you first get the kitchen set up and you make that first meal. And so cooking is so central to our lives. What is the connection between that and caring for the planet? What is the connection between how we eat and how we take care of the planet?
There's a deep connection, and we're only now unraveling the power of that connection, because I write about this often, that food has the power to change our lives. It's not just what we eat and what we cook, but how it was grown and raised, and the farmers, the work that the farmers do in the fields and the forests and foraging. And there is so much that goes into that plate that we're cooking at the end of the day, right after work, and we're feeding our kids or we're feeding ourselves. There's so much that goes into it. And then there's also the supply chain, right? The distribution of food, harvesting, distribution, bringing it to the groceries and the shelves around the world so that people like you and I can buy the food for our families, bring it home, cook it. And then at the end of it all, between the US and Canada, 58% of the food is actually thrown away. Like more than half the food that we grow and raise with such resources, time, land, greenhouse gas emissions, and all of that, we throw away more than half of it. And that bothers me a lot. And so that was part of this work that I do, the food waste, but also everything else that fits into what we cook and eat. And there is a deep connection. I mean, over the last 3 years, I've been doing my research on climate change and the climate science, and also in how we can shift the way we make our choices in the kitchen. And I'm delighted that there's so much that we can do right here in our own kitchens.
That's exciting. I mean, first I have to say, I've never heard that statistic. I knew there was a lot of food waste, but I'm just floored that it's that much. And I know that you talk about all the simple, accessible changes that we can make. Can you give us some examples of just some of the easy changes that people can make to really make a difference?
Part of my work over the last few years was designing a framework that I call Eating with Benefits. It's a funny name. And yes, and the benefits in this case are good health for ourselves and the health and prosperity of the planet. And so there's 5 strategies, and there's a little bit of an outline that people can find on Maple and Marigold, but it forms the heart of my book. And so it's really dear and near to my heart. But it's 5 strategies that I'm recommending that if we think of those 5 strategies as we go through, walk through the grocery aisles as we're cooking and making choices, we can make a lot of shifts in our own lives with just those 5 strategies. So I've got, I have them written down here because I've got as we're talking on Instagram live on social media, right? There's people popping up at the so 5 strategies that the first one, the biggest one always is to cut down our meat consumption. And it's often the one that gets people the most emotional because it's hard for a lot of people to imagine a delicious, abundant meal without meat, right? It's often the center of the table. And honestly, being vegan is the most climate-friendly way to eat. But I am not vegan, and I find it very hard. And I know many, many people do too. So my suggestion is that we half our meat. So if we can move away from meat, I don't know, there's so many hashtags out there, weekend vegan, Monday to Friday vegan, like do what we can in terms of numbers. If we can just halve our meat consumption, that will take us many steps forward already. And then the next one is switch it with pulses, legumes, beans, lentils. Love your lentils. I mean, there is so much that we can do in terms of food, in terms of swapping out meat and then swapping in pulses. That takes us many steps forward in this movement. And then the other 3 strategies are, well, shop local as much as we can. And it's not just farmers market. There's the supply chain, supply chain unraveling that happened during the pandemic is continuing at various levels in different economies around the world. So I know Canada is being hit hard, and that will just continue. Another suggestion that I have is to reduce waste. I mean, food waste is, of course, a big part of it. We've talked about that 50+ statistic, but there's so many other things that go into it because it's not just the food that we're wasting, the more than half the food that is grown and raised that we're wasting. It's also the resources that go into raising that food and storing it and shipping it in trucks and ships around the world, causing the greenhouse gases. And then in the end, we end up throwing half of it away, right?
Mm.
And it's not just, I mean, I have to be really upfront here that it's not just a personal responsibility. We need to be able to have the infrastructure and the system to support us to reduce that waste. And it's still a ways to go. And then the last one really is to add diversity to our diet, because adding something new, and it's something I used to tell my kids all the time, try something new, and it's hard often from a parent's point of view. But adding diversity to our diet, trying something new, sends a ripple. It starts a ripple effect in that starts with maybe trying a new whole grain for dinner, and it sends a message to the system that we want more of it, that we should grow more of it, instead of having just wheat, corn, and rice, which are the three of the five main crops that most of us eat around the world. If we grow millets, it's great for the soil. It helps regenerate the soil in different ways. It helps the farmer because it's often it takes less water and land to grow millet as it does to grow wheat and corn and soy. And so we're part of this whole larger system. And this eating with benefits diagram and this framework that I'm recommending is something that it has huge impacts, right? Our changes in the kitchen can have such a huge impact, but it can just start with something as simple as swapping out meat for lentils.
And I love that you're talking about when you're talking about swapping something out, but also swapping something in and introducing new foods and so, because I think one of the barriers to this is that a lot of people have the idea that we're depriving ourselves of something. Like you said, like, don't take away the meat because that's something people are kind of almost emotionally attached to. And yet you're talking about it's not just what you're taking away, it's what you're introducing. And that for you, this is part of this very joyful way of life, which is not necessarily how a lot of people think of it. So how does this lead to having a more joyful life? You talk about regaining your power in the kitchen, which is, I love that concept. So tell us more about that.
The joyful abundance, if we are to believe Instagram, and we really shouldn't, right? I know we're on Instagram right now, but Instagram is not real life. But if we're to believe in Instagram, then living sustainably is a spare, minimalist, very clean. I hate that word clean because my kitchen is rarely clean. But a very spare lifestyle. And I grew up in a family that we thought about food waste. We thought about what we shouldn't throw away. We thought about swapping things out and eating more affordable, accessible foods, whatever was available in the markets that day. And I didn't think that eating and living sustainably was in any way taking things away, right? The subtraction wasn't there. And it isn't. Like, if we accept it, if I believe sustainability is far more joyful and juicy and fun, and it involves more community and more sharing. And we have so much evidence to back that up, right? There's generations of families around the world who have lived sustainably, closer to the land, more connected with nature, and have had still juicy, beautiful, loving, and lovely lives. And that is the goal here, because all of this, climate conscious, climate smart, works only if we can bring some of that love and sharing into our lives, and we can.
Yes, and I love that perspective. And I have to think that perhaps growing up in India has given you a different perspective, because even just the centrality of meat, which, as you know, is so important in the North American diet, I would say is not the case in India, so you have like a very different perspective that you bring to it. And also, North America, one of the biggest things that we value is convenience. And people are so busy, work so much, running around. And at a time when most people are looking for what is the quickest way I can get a meal on the table, you're advocating for cooking at home more. So tell us about that. What are some of the easy kind of go-to meals that you like to use or that you recommend for people who think that they can't do this, that they need to swing by McDonald's or whatever it is because they just don't have time to cook at home, what would you recommend for them?
Sunday cooking. I mean, that's my biggest. It's one of the sections in my book too. But I hate the word meal prep because it often meant that I'm spending hours in the kitchen. But Sunday afternoon, I turn the lights on in the kitchen. I cook 4 batches of whole grains. I cook some tubers, so I try and stay away from potatoes as much as possible. So instead, we're eating sunchokes and sweet potato and yams and Japanese yams. And like there's a whole different variety of tubers out there. So I cook up a batch of that. And then I make a giant pot of vegetable sauce that my kids think is tomato sauce. So I add in tomatoes, whatever is in season, right? And so Sunday is often the time I clean the fridge out too. So I've got all the wilted greens and everything else, the celery that wasn't used during the previous week, toss it all in and cook down on the stove for maybe 30-35 minutes. And you've got these 3 things. So you've got the whole grains, you've got some tubers, and you've got like boiled or steamed tubers, and then you've got a sauce that you can add to a whole bunch of weeknight meals, because all of this works. And I know I'm repeating myself, but all of this works only if we can make it work in our real lives, right? Because most of us are raising our kids, paying our mortgages, getting to work, getting back, sitting in trains. But all of this can work is what I'm here to say. Like there is so much that we can do that is within our reach and can also bring our lives and our health closer to the health and long-term prosperity of the planet, because we need to think about that long-term, right? So in terms of ideas, I have a newsletter that I send out every couple of weeks, and I usually put a couple of recipes in there. There's some recipes on maple and marigold, but my favorite right now is millet. Like I've been cooking hulled millet every Sunday, swapping out our rice, and surprisingly, it takes the same amount of time as white rice to cook up on the stove. I keep pointing to my stove because I'm sitting in my kitchen right now. But millet is I get it at the bulk food store in Toronto where I live, and I can store it for a year in the pantry. I don't worry about, right, the expiration date, which don't get me started on that. But hulled millet, rinse it, wash it, and then cook it for about 20 minutes. The ratio of seed to water is about 1 to 2.5. And try it out today because it feels better in the belly. It's digestion is better because you're adding some extra different diverse microbiota to our bellies, and what goes in our bellies, what's healthy for our bellies is often healthy for our brain. There's a lot of work that is being done between food and mood. And when we feel better, we feel happier. I'm a better parent 100% when I feel better. Choosing millet in the grocery store is actually a choice, an active choice that starts that ripple in the food system that lets the powers that be know that we want more variety in our food. That leads to more agro biodiversity. It leads to better price management, better supply chain distribution, better farmers' lives, better soil, better health, better planet. It starts a ripple effect, which is the imagination. I mean, what we can do with just choosing millets and it could be anything else. Try something different. Like if you're a person who eats a lot of millet, switch to rice.
Yeah, and what you were saying about like that the choices that we make, the effect that they have, because I know at our grocery store, I mean, obviously farmers markets are wonderful, but in reality is a lot of people can't make it there or they can't do all of their shopping there. But I've known the past several years, at least our grocery stores have a whole section of locally grown produce. So are getting the message, maybe not as much as we want them to, but they're starting to get the message that people do want something locally grown. So I love that you're mentioning that. And also talking about diversity, that I feel like there's this idea out there that traditional foods are not, especially when you talk about multicultural ethnic foods, that they're not as healthy. I think there's that idea out there that these traditional diets are not good for your health, not good for the planet. Do you agree with that? And what role does diversity have to play in caring for the planet, whether diversity of cultures or diversity of foods?
Oh, I can't tell you how much I disagree with that. I mean, the things that TikTok will have us believe. I mean, Instagram and TikTok, sorry, I'm bad-mouthing the platform that we're literally on right now. It's a great way to connect and engage, but let's not get a lot of advice that we will adopt into our lives from social media. But, you know, generations of grandmas have known that the nose to tail food and the root to seed food. So that is eating everything that you bring in to your home and then eating it from root to seed is the way to eat. So before it was a trend on TikTok, grandmas knew that. Before probiotics were a trend on TikTok, my grandma would have us eat yogurt with our rice and lentils because she likely didn't know the words for it. She knew the combination of probiotics and prebiotics, which the fiber in lentils and vegetables, there's prebiotic fiber. So that probiotic and prebiotic combination is so great for us. Science is backing that up now. I mean, generations of grandmas knew what we are now seeing that science is also backing up. And so traditional cultures, there was so much wisdom in traditional cultures, and a lot of that wisdom is passed down from person to person rather than, you know, backing up with science. And we have this inclination to include science and discard anecdotal evidence. I mean, there's a lot of people who say, oh, this is just anecdotal, we should look at the science. But if we bring those two together, combine what, well, the grandmas knew with what we are finding out today, I mean, we're barely scratching the surface. There is so much for us to learn. And my approach is if we do this with humility and openness, and accept what has gone on for years and what we know today and try and bring them together. I mean, that's one of the best ways to approach food and anything else, in my opinion.
And I just want to mention, I think that a lot of times dominant culture, like our idea of what traditional foods are, is not necessarily accurate. I was just thinking, my sister, she lived in China for a while. When she came back, and she said, you know, what our idea of what Chinese food is really like special occasion foods. And so that's the idea. They're not looking at the whole picture of how people would eat on a daily basis, or going back kind of, as you said, like generations of this wisdom that people had. We're just looking, we pick the foods that we like, which maybe are not the healthiest. They're the things that were meant to be eaten only occasionally. But talking to you has made me so excited about your cookbook, and we have a few minutes left. I want to give you a chance to talk about it more, and then also if you want to emphasize again where people can connect with you. I know that you mentioned your newsletter, which has so much information in it. And it seems like every time I look at Instagram, you're doing another spot on television or on the radio or something like that. But tell us where people can connect with you, and also what we have to look forward to in your cookbook.
The best way to connect immediately is through Maple and Marigold. That's my website. And then Instagram, for all of its flaws, is also the first place that people find me, on Maple and Marigold on Instagram. But my book, yes, it's coming out. It's 80 plus recipes, climate conscious, mostly meat-free recipes that have and use affordable, accessible, often multicultural ingredients to people. I mean, what's multicultural to me may not be multicultural to you. So it brings some of the old recipes together. So, but more than the cooking, there is also the science. The first few chapters actually, it's the big why we need to cook the way we need to cook. So I've pulled in the key pieces of climate research into the first few chapters. I'm a person who wants to know the why before I can do the how. And so I split the book up the same way that I found I would learn, start with the why, and then show people the how. And comes out April 2024, around Earth Day, wherever you live. And very, very excited. I can't divulge the name and the cover yet, but I think another 2 weeks. If you're signed up for my newsletter, you will see the cover first. Like, I've got it printed off here and I can't share it here. I've been told to, well, stay shut for just a little bit longer.
Well, that's a good plug for people to sign up for your newsletter.
Right?
Follow you on Instagram.
Yes.
There. And will it be available for pre-order then?
Yes, so pre-orders should start as soon as November. I'll share all of the links on Instagram and on my newsletter when I get them. The publishers are Touchwood Editions out west in Vancouver. It's the Canadian independent publisher, and they're absolutely wonderful. They've done this many, many, many times. This is my first cookbook, but this is not their first book by any stretch. So thankfully, one of us in this relationship knows what they're doing.
But I can't wait for it. I encourage everybody to sign up for the newsletter. Follow her on Instagram. If you're joining us late, this interview will be up on Instagram in just a few minutes and later on our YouTube channel. And I'm excited because, as you know, we're going to be reading this book next spring in my book club. So maybe we're definitely going to have to do another live around that time so we can dig more into it once the book is available. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everybody who's watching. It was so wonderful to talk with you, Puneeta.
Thank you for inviting me. This was wonderful, and I want to do this again and again.
Yeah, me too. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.